In the autumn of 1874, while every other homesteader in the valley stacked cordwood and chinked their walls against the coming wet snow, George Holcomb was coating his entire cabin with a foul-smelling paste of whitewash and tallow. The logs shone greasy and slick, like hog fat smeared on a trough. Neighbors muttered that the man had finally cracked. But inside, his wife and 3 children huddled by the stove as the first storm gathered on the ridge. What did those glistening, water-beating walls hide? Would the strange coating save his family, or would it seal their tomb beneath a mountain of ice? George Holcomb was no fool. He was a 37-year-old widower's son who had spent his boyhood hauling buckets for his mother, a laundress who kept her wooden tubs from rotting with a slush of slaked lime and mutton tallow. That greasy paste was her secret, her only inheritance to him. Now, as the first wet snow began to fall, George was betting everything on a desperate idea, that the same coating could turn an entire cabin into a water-shedding fortress. If it worked, the walls would stay dry while others, cabins soaked and froze solid. If it failed, the logs would swell, crack, and bury his family under a mountain of ice. He never told anyone where the recipe came from. Not yet. The recipe came from a woman who had spent her entire life fighting water. Agnes Holcomb was a laundress in the river town of Galena, Illinois, long before her son ever set foot on the frontier. For 22 years, she scrubbed clothes for merchants and steamboat captains, her hands cracked and raw from lye soap. Her wooden wash tubs should have rotted out every season. They never did. Each autumn, Agnes would send young George to fetch quicklime from the kiln and render tallow from butcher's scraps. She'd heat the fat until it ran clear, then stir in slaked lime until the mixture turned thick as porridge. With a stiff brush, she'd paint the inside of every tub, every barrel, every wood pail the family owned. The coating hardened into something like varnish, but softer, greasy to the touch. Water beaded on it like pearls on a waxed floor. The tubs never swelled, split, or grew black mold. George grew up with the smell of that mixture in his nose. He never forgot it. Now, in the autumn of 1874, that childhood memory was the only thing standing between his family and the killing cold. George and his wife Mary had staked a claim in a narrow valley in the Dakota Territory, 300 miles from the nearest railhead. The cabin was built of rough-cut pine, logs notched together with nothing but dried moss for chinking. It was solid enough for fair weather, but the winter of 1873 had nearly killed them. A wet snowstorm in late November soaked the walls, and then the temperature plummeted to 20 below zero overnight. The water froze inside the logs, expanding the wood until the chinking cracked open. Wind howled through the gaps. Mary and the 3 children huddled beneath every blanket they owned while George fought to keep the fire alive. The baby, a girl named Elizabeth, caught frost on her cheeks that left scars she would carry for life. That spring, George vowed he would never lose another winter to the water. The idea of coating the cabin came to him in July, when he found an old leather journal his mother had left him. Agnes had died of cholera 6 years earlier, and the journal was the only possession he had from her. Inside, stuffed between pages of faded script, was a scrap of paper with her tub coating recipe written in pencil. Lime, mutton tallow, and just enough hot water to make a paste. Keeps water out, keeps wood sound, she had written. George read it a dozen times. Then he kissed the paper and tucked it into his shirt. He never told Mary what he was planning. Not at first. The neighbors began to notice in September when George started collecting quicklime from the abandoned kiln near the old sawmill. He hauled 50-pound sacks on his back for 2 miles. Then he slaughtered 2 of his sheep, not for meat but for the fat. He rendered the tallow in a huge iron kettle outside the cabin, the smell of cooking fat drifting across the valley. Men stopped by to ask what he was doing. George gave only vague answers. When he started mixing the lime and tallow in a barrel, the concoction turned a sickly yellowish gray, and the stench was enough to make a man gag. His neighbor to the east, a grizzled Norwegian named Lars Eriksson, came over to investigate. Lars had homesteaded in the valley for 14 years. He had lost 2 cabins to wet snow and freezing. He stood with his arms folded, watching George stir the foul paste with a long stick. "That the new paint you ordered from Chicago?" he asked with a hard grin. George didn't look up. "Something like that," Lars ran his thumb along the edge of the barrel, sniffed it, and spat on the ground. "Smells like you're embalming a corpse or cooking one." Then he walked away, shaking his head, and told the other homesteaders that George Holcomb had lost his senses out in that lonely claim. The story spread. A few days later, when George began brushing the mixture onto the walls of his cabin, the valley laughed openly. The stuff was thick and greasy. It didn't dry like paint. It smeared across the pine logs, leaving a slick, oily film that caught the pale autumn sun. The cabin looked like it had been dipped in lard. Mary stood on the porch, baby Elizabeth on her hip, her face tight with worry. She had trusted George through droughts, hailstorms, and failed crops, but this was different. "George," she said quietly one evening, "what exactly is this supposed to do?" He set down the brush and walked over to a bucket of water. He dipped his hand into the bucket, then splashed it against the coated wall. The water beaded instantly, rolling downward in fat droplets, leaving the wood beneath perfectly dry. "It's what my mother used to do," he said. Mary said nothing more, but she still looked toward the northern hills each morning, watching for the first hard snow. By mid-October, the entire cabin was coated. The greasy walls glistened even on cloudy days. The smell of tallow hung in the air around the homestead like a permanent fog. Mice came out of the fields at night, licking at the lower logs, but they learned quickly that lime was poison. A few died near the doorstep. The vultures came, then left. The homestead felt like a place under some strange spell. Lars Eriksson rode by one afternoon and saw George's two older children, a boy of 10 named Thomas and a girl of 8 named Anna, helping their father apply a second coat to the north wall. The lard-like paste coated the children's hands. The boy had a smear of whitewash on his cheek. Lars reined in his horse and stared. "You're teaching your young ones to waste good fat on walls," he said. "What happens when you run out of food? You gonna eat the house?" George didn't answer. He simply kept brushing. Then, on the 27th of October, the weather turned. A cold rain began falling in the afternoon, not a hard storm but a steady, soaking drizzle that froze on contact with the cold ground. The basin turned to ice. The other homesteaders hurried to finish their chinking, piling straw and mud into the cracks between their logs. But George Holcomb did something they all found baffling. He stood out front of his slick, greasy cabin with his arms at his sides, watching the rain hit the walls. The water beaded on the tallow, formed rivulets, and ran down in sheets, never soaking into the wood. Behind the cabin, a small puddle began to form where the water collected in the dirt. His son Thomas came outside and stood beside him. "Pa, why are you just standing there?" George didn't take his eyes off the wall. "Because I need to see if it holds," he said. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees above zero. The drizzle turned to sleet, then to a wet, clumping snow that stuck to everything it touched. Branches snapped under the weight. Fence posts sagged. Inside their cabins, the other homesteaders could hear the logs groaning as the moisture soaked in and began to freeze. But inside the Holcomb cabin, the walls stayed dry. Mary lit a second candle and ran her hand along the inside of the north wall. No dampness. No frost forming in the joints. She looked at George, and for the first time in weeks her expression softened. "It's working," she whispered. George only nodded. He stayed up late that night watching the walls, waiting for a leak that never came. At midnight, he finally allowed himself to believe that his mother's recipe might actually save them. But then the cold deepened, and something began happening inside the walls that George could not see. The tallow, which had repelled the water so perfectly, was now freezing solid in the sub-zero air. The lime mixture, designed for thin tub staves, was not flexible enough for thick, expanding logs. As the temperature fell, the greasy coating contracted unevenly. Tiny hairline cracks began to spider across the surface, invisible in the dark but widening with each degree of cold. By 3 in the morning, the wind shifted, driving a fresh wave of wet snow directly against the north face. The cracks grew. Water found its way through the fissures and into the pine logs beneath. And deep within the wood, the ice began to form again, silent, patient, destructive. George Holcomb slept, unaware that his mother's miracle was already starting to fail. Dawn broke pale and bitter over the homestead. The temperature had dropped to 4 below zero, and the first thing George saw when he opened his eyes was a spiderweb of frost on the inside of the north wall, not on the log surface, but deep within the joints between the beams. He sat up slowly, his breath clouding in the cold air. Mary was already awake, crouched beside the stove, feeding split pine into the flames. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The wall was speaking for itself. George walked to the north corner and pressed his palm against the wood. The surface was dry on the inside, but the log itself felt heavy, dense, cold in a way that went beyond temperature. Water had gotten in somehow. The coating outside must have cracked. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the frozen dawn. There it was. A network of fine lines ran across the greased wall like cracks through old porcelain. The tallow had contracted in the deep freeze, pulling apart along the seams of the lime paste. Where the cracks had opened, wet snow had found a path. Now that moisture was frozen solid inside the pine, expanding the wood from within. George touched one of the fissures with his thumb. The edge crumbled away. The whole north wall was rotting before his eyes, not from rain but from ice growing inside its own skin. He stood there for a long time, the wind cutting through his coat, while a single thought ran through his mind. His mother's tubs had never faced anything like this. They sat in a warm laundry shed, never exposed to sub-zero wind for days on end. The tallow stayed slightly soft near the stove. Here on the open prairie, the coating had become brittle as glass. George had copied the recipe exactly but forgotten the heat. That was the variable he never considered. The mixture worked only as long as it remained pliable. Frozen solid, it became its own worst enemy. Back inside the cabin, Mary was running her hand along the inner wall, her fingers tracing the frost lines. Thomas and Anna sat on the floor, wrapped in blankets, watching their parents with the quiet terror of children who understood too much. Baby Elizabeth coughed in her sleep. Mary finally looked at George. "Is it gone?" she asked. The promise in her voice was already half broken. George couldn't lie. "Part of it," he said. "I can fix it, but I need to redo the coat while the next warm spell comes." Mary turned away, her silence heavier than any accusation. The next 3 days were a race against the weather. The sky stayed clear and brutal cold, too cold for any repair. The tallow mixture would freeze before it even bonded to the logs. George tried once in desperation, heating the paste over an outdoor fire and slapping it against the cracked wall with a wide brush. The stuff stiffened within seconds, cracking as it cooled. It didn't seal. It peeled off in strips like frozen skin. He gathered the fallen scraps and threw them into the fire, watching the fat sizzle and flare. For the first time since autumn, he felt a whisper of real fear, not for himself but for the baby with the scarred cheeks, for the boy who still believed his father could outthink any storm. On the 4th day, the wind shifted. A Chinook blew in from the mountains, a warm Pacific breath that could raise the temperature by 40 degrees in an hour. The snow on the roof began to melt, dripping from the eaves in heavy drops. The greased walls grew slick again, the tallow softening under the sudden warmth. George saw his chance. He ran outside and built a large fire not 3 feet from the north wall, close enough to warm the logs without scorching them. Then he heated the lime tallow mix in a small iron pot until it was nearly boiling, thin enough to flow but thick enough to cling. He brushed it on while the wood was still warm to the touch. The paste seeped into the cracks, filling them like grout in stonework. For hours he worked, section by section, heating the wood, then coating, then moving the fire down the wall. Mary brought him coffee and stood watching in silence. The new layer wasn't just a patch. It was a different animal entirely. The hot application bonded the tallow to the wood fibers, creating a flexible seal that could stretch and contract with temperature changes. George had accidentally reinvented his mother's method, not for tubs but for a living, breathing cabin wall. By nightfall, the entire north face was recoated. The wall glistened like wet leather. George stayed outside long after dark, running his hand over the surface, feeling the warmth still trapped within the log. He refused to go to sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark near the north wall, watching, waiting, listening for any sound of cracking. The temperature dropped again around midnight. The Chinook faded. A light snow began to fall. This time the wall held. No fissures appeared. The coating flexed slightly under the weight of the snow but never broke. George finally allowed himself to go inside. Mary was awake, nursing the baby. She met his eyes and saw something there she hadn't seen in weeks. hope but cautious, guarded. "It'll hold tonight," he said. "But what about the next storm and the one after that?" He didn't answer because he didn't know. Not yet. Word of George's struggle spread through the valley. Lars Eriksson heard about the cracked coating and nodded with grim satisfaction. He had warned the man. A cabin couldn't be greased like a wagon axle and expected to survive winter. But another neighbor took a different view. His name was Otto Müller, a German tanner who had worked with fats and hides his entire life. Otto rode over one afternoon and inspected the wall with curious, careful eyes. He smelled the tallow, scratched the surface with a fingernail, and asked George exactly how he had applied the mixture. George explained about the cold paste and the freezing. Otto shook his head slowly. "Tall is meant to be hot worked," he said. "You cannot paint it like milk. You must marry it to the wood with heat." That single word, marry, stuck in George's mind. He had been slapping on a shield. What he needed was a bond, a skin that grew with the cabin, not just a coat that sat on top. Otto left him with a small pouch of pine resin. "Mix a little of this into your next batch," he said. "It'll give the tallow teeth." The pine resin changed everything. George experimented with small batches, boiling resin with the tallow before adding the lime. The resulting paste was stickier, more elastic. When he brushed it onto a warm log, it sank into the grain like stain. The next test came sooner than anyone expected. 5 days after Otto's visit, the valley was hit by a true wet snow, the kind that packed dense and heavy, the kind that had nearly destroyed the cabin the year before. Snow fell for 18 hours straight, not a blizzard but a steady, soaking dump. Every log on every other homestead began drinking up moisture from the air and the melt. Inside the Holcomb cabin, Mary watched the walls with the intensity of a guard on watch. Hours passed. The snow mounted on the roof, but the logs stayed dry. No frost lines appeared. No swelling joints. The coating was breathing with the wood. That night, for the first time in weeks, Mary slept deeply, her hand resting on George's chest, rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who had just pulled his family back from the edge. But the true test hadn't come yet, and it was building in the clouds above the mountains to the west. The last week of November brought a weather pattern that old-timers in the territory called the Black Ice Front. It started with a warm, wet low that could dump sleet for 2 days straight, then a sudden Arctic blast that would flash freeze everything in place. Cabins would become blocks of ice. Livestock would freeze standing up. The only defense was to batten down and pray. As the pressure fell, the homesteaders gathered for a hasty community meeting at the Eriksson place. Lars stood by the fire and laid out the forecast. "This one will test every wall, every roof, every man," he said. "If your chinking isn't tight, if your wood is green, if you cut corners, the ice will find it." Then he looked directly at George. "Your grease wall might keep out rain, but what about when the rain freezes solid and expands? It'll rip that tallow right off." The room was silent. George said nothing in return, but a small voice inside him remembered Otto's resin. The coating wasn't just grease anymore. It was a tanned hide. That made all the difference. Late that afternoon, George did something no one expected. He invited Lars to come see the cabin wall for himself. Lars hesitated, then agreed. The two men walked through the snow to the Holcomb claim, the wind already picking up from the west. George showed him the north wall, now a dark, leather-like surface with no visible cracks. He poured a bucket of water against it. The water rolled off, and when the cold air hit the wet surface, it froze into a thin sheet that peeled away without adhering to the wood. Lars ran his hand over the wall, feeling the slight give of the resin-toughened tallow. His skepticism wavered. "She'll hold," he said grudgingly, "so long as the whole wall don't twist." That last phrase hung in the air like a sentence unfinished, because the storm arrived that night with a violence no one had predicted. The warm sleet came first, a drenching curtain of near-freezing rain that coated every surface in a layer of slush. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 40 minutes. The slush froze into a clear, dense rind of ice that fused to every untreated log, every fence post, every blade of grass. In other cabins, the ice bonded to the wood and began to expand, cracking logs from the outside. Inside the Holcomb cabin, George listened. The sleet hammered the roof, but the walls stayed mute. No cracking, no groaning. He went outside in the dark, holding a lantern, and saw that the ice was glazing the tallow coating but not penetrating it. When he tapped the ice with a stick, it shattered off, leaving the greasy surface intact. The coating was shedding the freeze itself. But then the wind shifted violently, driving ice pellets directly against the south wall, the side he had not recoated with the resin mixture. That wall had only the original cold-applied paste, the one that had already cracked once. And now, under the assault of driven ice, it began to fail. George heard a sharp crack, then another. He ran to the south side. A chunk of ice had split a seam in the old coating, and water was already seeping into the log beneath. In this flash freeze, the water would turn solid within minutes and shatter the wood from within. He had no time to build a fire, no time to heat the paste. So he did the only thing left. He stripped off his coat, balled it up, and pressed it against the crack, using his own body heat to slow the freezing while Mary frantically melted tallow inside on the stove. Thomas ran out with a steaming pot of hot mixture, and together they troweled it into the wound, sealing it while the ice still tried to claim the wall. By dawn, the storm had spent itself, and the south wall stood scarred but whole. George sat in the snow, exhausted, his hands blistered from the hot paste, and realized that his mother's recipe had saved them all over again. But the name for the mixture was still missing, and that name would come from the heart of the storm itself. The black ice front had scarred every homestead in the valley except one. Over the following days, as the temperature crept back to 20 degrees, the other families emerged to inspect the damage. Lars Eriksson found his north wall splintered in 3 places. The logs split open like cracked marrow bones. Otto Muller's chinking had failed entirely on the west gable, leaving a hole the size of a barrel that he had to stuff with frozen blankets just to keep his children from frostbite. The Jensens, a young couple a mile south, woke to find their entire roof beam had warped from ice expansion, the ridge pole threatening to snap. No one had died, but the fabric of the settlement was fraying. And the true winter had not even arrived yet. Lars came to the Holcomb claim without being asked. He brought 2 other men with him, quiet, weather-beaten farmers who had mocked George in the fall. They stood silently in the snow and studied the cabin walls, gray and glistening like the skin of some sea animal. George was on the roof, shoveling off the last of the frozen sleet. When he climbed down, Lars met him with a question that had no easy answer. How bad was the south wall? George led them around the corner. The scar from the driven ice was visible, a dark slash in the tallow coat where the crack had nearly claimed them, but the hot applied patch held firm. Lars pressed his thumb into it and felt the slight yield, the resinous tackiness that Otto's pine gum had given the mixture. He pulled his knife and scraped a small fleck off, rolling it between his fingers. "This is tanner's work," he said. "Not farmer." Otto, who had arrived a few minutes later, nodded slowly. "It is a hide for the house, and a hide is stronger than bark alone." That afternoon, inside the warmth of George's cabin, Otto explained the principle to the gathered men. Normal whitewash was lime and water, a breathable skin that let moisture pass in and out. But the addition of tallow, specifically mutton tallow, changed the structure. The fat molecules coated the lime particles, creating a hydrophobic barrier that water could not penetrate. And the pine resin acted as an emulsifier, binding the fat to the wood lignin itself. It was not paint, it was a living seal. Mary served coffee and the men listened, their earlier mockery replaced by something closer to reverence. Thomas sat in the corner with Anna, watching his father in a new light. The baby coughed once, then slept. Then the tallow issue surfaced. George had slaughtered his last 2 sheep for the initial coating. He had no more animals to spare, and mutton tallow was scarce in the valley. Otto offered a solution from his tanning trade. Beef suet, rendered the same way, would work almost as well, but it had to be clarified carefully or it would go rancid and attract pests. The men agreed to pool their fat stores. The butcher in town sent a gallon of clean beef suet. A farmer contributed a sack of quicklime. Otto gave pine resin from his tannery. In return, George agreed to show them how to mix and apply the coating. The knowledge was no longer his alone. His mother's recipe was becoming a community asset, but the weather had other plans. In the second week of December, the barometer dropped to record lows. The sky turned a dirty yellow-gray, the color of bruised fruit. The wind stilled. The old-timers recognized the signs. This was not a black ice front. This was a wet siege, a Pacific-born storm that would carry deep moisture from the ocean and dump it as heavy, drenching snow for days on end. And when the moisture met the Arctic air behind it, the whole world would freeze into a solid block. The last time such a storm had hit the territory was 12 years earlier. Entire villages had vanished under pack ice until spring. The night before the storm, George walked the perimeter of his cabin with a lantern. Every inch of the walls had been recoated with the new suet lime resin mixture, hot applied and bonded. The south wall scar was triple layered. The chinking gaps had been filled with a paste-soaked hemp thread. He had done everything possible. But as he stood in the absolute stillness, the air so quiet he could hear his own heart, a single fear coiled in his gut. The wet siege would not just test the walls. It would test the roof, the windows, the foundation. If the water found any path at all, the freeze that followed would tear the entire structure apart. Mary came out to join him, the baby wrapped tightly against her chest. She had grown stronger over the weeks, her face sharper, her eyes harder. She had buried a son 2 years earlier, an infant who never took his first breath. She would not bury another. "Is it ready, George?" she asked. He hesitated. Then he told her the truth he had never spoken aloud. The recipe wasn't just for tubs. Mother used it to seal the windows of our house in Galena every winter. The one winter she forgot the north window. The ice split the frame and my father nearly froze before they could fix it. Mary stared at him. "Why didn't you tell me that?" George looked at the dark sky. "Because I was afraid I'd forgotten something else she taught me." He hadn't. But the storm would force him to remember one last detail he had buried deep in childhood memory. The wet siege began at 2 in the morning with a sound unlike any George had heard before. Not wind, not sleet, but a heavy, sodden thump as the first wave of wet snow hit the roof. It was snow with the density of wet sand, packing instantly on every surface. By dawn, the ground was covered in 18 inches of gray sludge that never fully froze. The temperature hovered just above freezing, the air soaked with moisture. The cabin walls beaded immediately, water rolling down in sheets. The coating was working. But the moisture in the air was so thick that condensation formed on the window glass, the metal hinges, every bare surface inside the house. Mary kept a fire roaring, but the damp crept in like a living thing. The children's blankets grew clammy. The baby coughed more often. Then in the late afternoon of the second day, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, as if a door had been thrown open to the Arctic. In the space of an hour, the world froze solid. The wet snow on the ground turned to iron-hard pack. The water rolling down the greased walls froze into long, transparent ribbons that hung from the eaves like glass spears. But the coating itself did not crack. The suet-based paste remained slightly pliable because Otto's pine resin had lowered its freezing point just enough to keep it flexible in the deep cold. George stood at the window and watched the frost claim everything beyond the cabin, the fences, the trees, the wagon, everything except his walls. Then the reports started to drift across the valley, carried by men on improvised snowshoes. The Jensen cabin had lost its west wall entirely. The logs had soaked in the wet snow and then exploded when the freeze expanded the water. The family was alive, but they were huddled in a dugout root cellar. Otto Muller's tannery roof had collapsed under the weight of frozen slush. Lars Eriksson's cabin was holding barely, but the ice had sealed his door shut, and he had to chop his way out with an axe. Across the valley, homesteaders were facing ruin. And still the wet snow fell, now mixed with freezing rain, a vicious cycle of soak and freeze that no untreated wood could survive. On the third night, the temperature fell to 22 below zero. Inside the Holcomb cabin, George sat awake while his family slept. The walls were dry, the chinking held. The baby's breathing had steadied. He could hear, faintly through the storm, the cracking sounds of trees snapping in the woods, but the cabin did not groan. The tallow coating, his mother's recipe, had turned the building into something the storm could not grip. The water had no purchase, and without water freezing inside the logs, there was no expansion, no splitting, no slow death of the wood. But the revelation came at dawn. When George opened the door, he found that the water running off the walls had frozen into a curved, glossy barrier that wrapped around the entire foundation like a low ice wall. It was 2 feet high, thick as a man's arm, and it angled outward from the base of the logs. The runoff had created its own defense. The ice wall deflected the wind, prevented drifts from burying the door, and even reflected a small amount of heat outward, creating a microclimate of still air around the house. The storm had not just failed to destroy the cabin. The storm had helped fortify it, building a frozen rampart from the very water the coating rejected. George called Mary outside. She stood in the impossible silence, the gray light catching the ice wall's sheen, and she began to cry. Not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief that they were going to survive, that her baby would not freeze, that the walls would hold. Thomas came to the door and stared at the ice barrier with wide eyes. "Pa, the storm built us a fence," he said. George knelt in the snow and pulled the boy close. "No, son, the storm didn't build it. That fence is your grandmother's work. She's been dead 6 years, but today she saved us all." That evening, with the storm finally spent and the moon clearing the ridge, George made a decision. He took a scrap of plank and a lump of charcoal from the stove. In careful letters, he wrote a name on the wood and nailed it above the cabin door. The name was Agnes's Paste. Mary saw it and took his hand. "Your mother would have liked that," she said. George looked up at the sign and felt something shift inside him. The coating was no longer just a desperate gamble. It was a legacy. A woman who had spent her life sealing washtubs had, from beyond the grave, sealed an entire home against the killing cold. And now everyone in the valley would know her name. But the true impact of that name would not become clear until the spring thaw, when the other cabins were still crumbling from hidden ice damage, and the Holcomb cabin stood intact, dry, and ready for planting season. That was when the requests began to pour in, not just for the recipe but for the story. And the story, as all true stories do, only grew larger with each telling. The storm had passed, but the legend of the greasy walls was just beginning to spread across the territory. Spring arrived in the valley like a slow exhalation. The ice barrier that had ringed the Holcomb cabin for 4 months began to soften in the lengthening daylight, its glossy surface turning porous, then crumbling into gray slush that soaked into the thawing earth. By the first week of April, the snow had retreated enough for the homesteaders to take full stock of the damage, and what they found was a map of ruin drawn across every untreated wall. Lars Eriksson's cabin, which had seemed to hold through the wet siege, had been dying in secret. The ice had penetrated the chinking in a dozen places, then melted and refrozen so many times that the pine logs themselves had begun to delaminate, splitting along the grain like firewood. When Lars pressed a crowbar against the north corner, the entire section shifted outward by 2 inches. The cabin would need to be rebuilt before another winter. Otto Mueller fared better because he had used a linseed oil treatment on his tannery, but the roof had collapsed in the freeze, and the rebuilding cost him half his spring production. The Jensens, the young couple who had lost their west wall, had spent the worst months in a dugout. They emerged thin and hollow-eyed, their infant son coughing with the same deep rattle that Elizabeth Holcomb had once carried. Across the valley, 17 homesteads had suffered major structural damage. 3 families had abandoned their claims entirely, loading wagons with whatever could be salvaged and heading east before the mud roads became impassable. The Holcomb cabin stood untouched. Not a single log had split. The chinking was intact, the roof beam straight, the windows sealed tight. When George inspected the foundation, he found no frost heave, no ice wedging, no hidden rot waiting beneath the surface. The coating had not merely shed water. It had preserved the wood in a state of arrested decay, as if the cabin had spent the winter inside a sealed jar. The only sign of the season's violence was the ghostly outline of the ice wall, a faint ring of packed silt and dead grass that marked where the runoff had frozen into a barrier and then melted back into the earth. Thomas and Anna walked that ring like children tracing a fairy circle, their bare feet pressing into the cold mud. Mary stood in the doorway with baby Elizabeth on her hip, watching George run his hand over the dry, gray logs. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Mary said, "I didn't believe it would work. Not really. Not until this morning." George turned to her, and for the first time since autumn, the deep lines around his eyes softened. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Not until I saw the Jensen's dugout." That afternoon, George walked to the Jensen's claim with a bucket of suet, a sack of lime, and a small pouch of pine resin. He found them sitting on the collapsed logs of their west wall, the husband staring at the ground, the wife holding the baby against her shoulder. George set the bucket down. "This is what I used," he said. "I'll show you how to mix it. You can rebuild with what you have, and this will keep the next storm out." The man looked up, his eyes raw with exhaustion. "We have no money for fat," he said. George shook his head. "There's no charge. My mother gave this recipe away for nothing. I'm doing the same." Word traveled through the valley faster than any wagon. Within a week, a dozen families had come to the Holcomb claim asking for the mixture. George did not hoard the knowledge. He showed them how to render suet until it ran clear, how to slake the lime until it stopped hissing, how to stir in resin until the paste took on the tackiness of fresh pine sap. He insisted on one rule: the wood must be warm when the mixture touched it. He taught them to build a fire beside the wall and wait until the logs felt warm to the palm, because the bond would not form on cold surfaces. Otto Mueller began sourcing pine resin from a larger tannery in the next county, trading hides for gallon jars of the amber gum. Lars Eriksson, despite his stubborn pride, spent 3 days at the Holcomb claim watching Jor apply a fresh coat to the goat shed. Then he went home and coated his own rebuilt cabin, every log, every chink, every seam. That autumn, for the first time in 15 years, he did not dread the first snow. The recipe, which had been scrawled on a scrap of paper in Agnes Holcomb's journal, began to multiply. Women copied it into their household books alongside recipes for soap and salve. Men scratched the ratios into the wooden handles of their tools. A schoolteacher from the nearest settlement wrote it down in a letter to her sister in Minnesota. The name Agnes's paste stuck because it was honest. It named the woman behind the work, and on the frontier, where women's labor was too often invisible, that naming carried weight. George received no money for the recipe, but he earned something he valued more: the knowledge that his mother's hands would outlive her, that the smell of tallow and lime would drift from 100 cabins on 100 winter mornings. By the summer of 1875, the story had spread beyond the valley. A surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad passed through and wrote a brief account in his field notes, describing a cabin with walls as slick as greased leather that had survived a winter that crushed other structures. A territorial newspaper ran a small item under the headline, "A woman's receipt saves a settlement." The clipping found its way back to Galena, Illinois, where an old woman who had once known Agnes Holcomb read it aloud to her grown daughters. They wept, not from sorrow, but from the strange, fierce pride of seeing a laundress remembered for something more than laundry. And then, in the spring of 1881, 7 years after the winter of the Greasy Walls, a young chemist from the University of Minnesota read that same newspaper account while researching frontier building methods. His name was Dr. Henry Alderman, and he specialized in the chemistry of fats and alkalis. Something about the description caught his attention: the combination of lime and tallow, the way the mixture hardened but remained pliable, the fact that it shed water so completely. Alderman wrote to George Holcomb, requesting a sample of the paste. George scraped a few ounces from a patch on the shed wall and mailed it in a tin box, along with a copy of his mother's original recipe. What Alderman found under his microscope was a revelation that would not be fully understood for decades. When mutton tallow, which is rich in stearic acid, combined with slaked lime, which is calcium hydroxide, an unexpected chemical reaction occurred. The two substances formed calcium stearate, a waxy, water-insoluble salt that bonded mechanically to cellulose fibers in wood. This was not merely a coating. It was a primitive form of hydrophobic soap, chemically fused to the surface of the logs. The lime did not simply thicken the tallow. It transformed it into a compound that was chemically opposed to water. And the pine resin, Alderman noted, provided the necessary tack to keep the calcium stearate embedded in the wood grain as the underlying log expanded and contracted with temperature. Agnes Holcomb, 2 decades before the first synthetic waterproofing agents were patented, had stumbled onto a chemical principle that would later underpin the entire modern industry of industrial wood sealants. Alderman published his findings in a small chemistry journal in 1883, under the title, "On a Frontier Waterproofing Composition of Uncommon Efficacy." He gave full credit to an unnamed laundress from Galena, whose practical genius had preceded the laboratory by a generation. The article was read by a handful of specialists and then largely forgotten, buried in the avalanche of 19th-century scientific literature. Jor never knew about the paper. He died in 1902 at the age of 65, still living in the cabin with the greasy walls. Mary had died 6 years earlier. Thomas and his wife had taken over the claim, while Anna had married a farmer in the next county. Elizabeth, the baby whose scarred cheeks had once driven George to desperation, grew up to become a midwife, carrying her grandmother's recipe to every birth she attended, using a diluted form of the paste to seal the seams of wooden birthing tubs. The continuity was so perfect it felt like design. The cabin itself remained standing for 57 years after that first winter. It outlasted every other structure in the original settlement. The walls never rotted, never split, never needed to be rechinked. The coating did require renewal every few years on the north and west faces, where the weather hit hardest, but the maintenance was trivial compared to the labor of rebuilding. In 1931, a violent spring tornado ripped through the valley and leveled half the town. The Holcomb cabin lost its roof, but the walls stood firm, the logs still bound by the tallow seal that had married them together. A photograph taken by a county surveyor the following week shows the roofless walls glistening faintly in the gray light, with the sign Agnes's Paste still nailed above the door, the charcoal letters faded but legible. The image made its way into a Works Progress Administration archive during the Great Depression, filed under Frontier Homestead's timber frame preservation. And that archive, decades later, would be rediscovered by a materials scientist researching traditional waterproofing methods. But that is another chapter. The immediate truth was this: a laundress who had never traveled west, who had never seen a winter blizzard on the open prairie, who had died in a rented room in Galena with calloused hands and a journal full of receipts, had saved not only her son's family but an entire community. Her greasy paste, born from the humble labor of keeping wash tubs sound, had become a shield against the darkest force the frontier could unleash. The storm had not been defeated. It had been outwitted by soap. The storm had not been defeated. It had been outwitted by soap. And that is perhaps the most overlooked truth of the frontier. Survival was not always about strength, not always about the sharpest axe or the thickest coat. Sometimes it was about a woman stirring a kettle of fat and lime, her fingers cracked from lye, her mind fixed on the simple problem of keeping a tub from leaking. Agnes Holcomb never saw the Dakota Territory. She never witnessed the wet siege or the black ice front. But when the blizzard found her son's cabin, it found her work waiting, and her work held. The recipe that she scribbled in a journal, probably on a winter evening much like the ones her son would later endure, became a shield across an entire valley. It outlasted her son, outlasted even the cabin that first bore the greasy walls. When Dr. Alderman looked through his microscope and saw calcium stearate, he was only catching up to what a laundress had understood with her hands 40 years earlier. Science, in the end, did not invent the waterproofing principle. It just gave a name to what Agnes had already done. That is the quiet miracle of ordinary labor. The knowledge that lives in washhouses and kitchens in the calloused grip of a woman hauling water often holds the answer to problems that later generations will try to solve with textbooks and laboratories. George Holcomb did not set out to be an inventor. He was a desperate father with a baby girl whose cheeks had scarred from frost. He had no university, no patent, no laboratory. But he had his mother's voice in his memory and a scrap of paper that smelled faintly of tallow. The question that lingers is not whether the recipe worked. It did, spectacularly. The question is how many other recipes, whispered from mother to son, from laundress to midwife, have been lost to time. How many other cabins could have stood against the winter if someone had simply remembered? The frontier is full of stories like this, small acts of preservation that no one writes down until a newspaper clipping or a surveyor's photograph snatches them from oblivion. But for every one that survives, there are 100 that vanish with the last person who remembered the proportions of fat to lime. And so we are left with George Holcomb on that spring morning, his hand pressed against a dry log, the ghost of the ice wall still marking the ground, and above his door a sign that read Agnes's Paste. He had not only saved his family, he had inscribed his mother's name into the very architecture of survival. The greasy walls did not merely repel water. They repelled the anonymity that so often buries the labor of women, the forgetting that erases the knowledge of those who worked with their hands. If you drive through the northern plains today, the Holcomb cabin is gone. Even the foundation stones were carted away decades ago. But the chemistry that a laundress discovered lives on in modern wood sealants, in the calcium stearate that lines industrial waterproof coatings, in the quiet legacy of a woman who never knew she was a pioneer. The storm still comes to the prairie every winter. But every log that stays dry in a driving sleet owes something, however faintly, to a mother's recipe that refused to be forgotten. So was George Holcomb simply a man who coated his cabin in grease? Or was he a messenger, carrying forward a truth that had been hiding in plain sight at the wash tub? Subscribe now to witness more forgotten histories, where the line between life and death was drawn by ordinary people who remembered what others forgot.